I was scheduled for a standard night shift in Queens. It wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary: routine patrols, traffic stops, a domestic call here or there. My partner that night was Officer R. He was the kind of cop everyone trusted. Quiet, methodical, steady under pressure. I had worked a few shifts with him in the past, and he had a way of making difficult calls feel almost manageable. There wasn't a single thing unusual about him, as far as I knew. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleamed under the streetlights, and his presence in the car had a calming effect on me. We started the evening with a domestic call in one of the quieter sections of Queens. It was a tense situation. A couple had gotten into an argument, and things were escalating, but neither party was physically injured. Officer R handled it calmly, talking to both individuals, keeping the situation under control while I checked the surroundings and documented everything. Nothing more came of it. We cleared the call, and I radioed in our status, still thinking it was a normal night. As we drove through the city, passing rows of brownstones, corner stores, and flickering streetlights, I felt the usual hum of a patrol shift, the low rumble of the engine, the faint smell of coffee and sweat from our uniforms, the intermittent crackle of the radio. We hadn't seen anything unusual yet. I had a folder on the passenger seat with paperwork from the earlier call. An officer sat quietly in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, eyes scanning the streets. He wasn't talking much, just the occasional nod or a quiet comment when we passed other units. Halfway through the shift, I radioed dispatch to check in. Unit 5 David, still 10 to 8. I said standard procedure, letting them know we were active and clear. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to make me glance at Officer R. He was staring straight ahead, expression unreadable, not moving a muscle. Then dispatch spoke. 5 David, your single unit tonight. No partner assigned. I froze for a second, my heart skipping. I looked across the car at him. He hadn't said anything, hadn't reacted in the slightest. His hands stayed where they were, his eyes forward, calm as if nothing had changed. I repeated the message in my head, trying to make sense of it. Single unit. No partner. That made no sense. I had been working with him for hours already. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe dispatch had made a mistake. Maybe the system had a glitch. I checked my onboard computer to confirm the roster. Nothing. No record of Officer R being scheduled. No active key fob swipe for him entering the station. No official assignment. My stomach dropped. I remembered seeing him at roll call earlier, walking in, greeting people, chatting for a minute with the sergeant. I had seen him walk past the cameras on the way to the briefing room. It all felt real. Every interaction had felt real. But the official records said otherwise. He wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to focus on the shift, but my mind kept returning to him. I could feel him sitting next to me, the weight of his presence, the uniform, the badge, the polished shoes. Everything about him screamed real. We continued patrol, responded to minor incidents, checked in at various points. I kept glancing at him, watching his hands on the wheel, the way he adjusted the radio, the slight tap of his fingers against the steering column while he waited at red lights. All of it normal, all of it real. And yet, the knowledge that he shouldn't be there gnawed at me. We stopped for a routine traffic check near a dimly lit corner of a street. I got out and approached the vehicle, doing my part of the inspection. Officer R stayed in the patrol car, silent, scanning the block. Everything about him was professional, familiar, expected. Nothing strange. I even caught myself thinking about how strange it was that I was beginning to forget the message from dispatch. It was like a creeping fog in my brain, trying to normalize the impossible. After a few hours, I suggested we grab a coffee at a 24-hour diner just off Queens Boulevard. He agreed, still quiet, and I watched him move like any other officer. He knew the routine, knew how to order without drawing attention, knew how to keep the uniform clean and in place. I sat across from him, staring at him while we waited for our coffee, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on me. I thought about how he had been suspended 6 months earlier for an incident at a different precinct. I remembered hearing about it, the paperwork, the internal review. He wasn't supposed to be on duty that night. Not in any possible sense. No one had cleared him. He had no badge access, no clearance, no record in the system. Yet here he was, breathing, moving, reacting to street lights and traffic, scanning license plates, sitting next to me for hours without anyone noticing. We returned to patrol. I stayed hyper-aware, watching him. Nothing he did was abnormal, but everything about the situation was wrong. I checked the time, checked dispatch logs, and ran a silent mental inventory of the night. Every movement he made, Every interaction we had, every light and shadow passing through the windshield real. Undeniably real. Yet, officially, he didn't exist. By the end of the shift, I felt exhausted. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally. The city had quieted down. The streets were almost empty, just the occasional car passing by, the faint hum of distant trains, the muted barking of dogs behind chain-link fences. I pulled into the precinct lot to check out. Officer parked next to me and sat still, just staring ahead, hands on the wheel, the same unreadable expression he had carried all night. I stepped out, finally, and as I did, I glanced over at him. He didn't move. I walked to the front of the car and checked in at the desk. The dispatcher confirmed once again, single unit tonight. No partner assigned. I went to the computer, reviewing the roster, reviewing key fob logs, everything. Nothing. No record of him arriving. Nothing that indicated he had ever been there. I turned back toward the car. He was gone. No one had moved him, no one had asked him to leave, and the car doors were locked. I opened the passenger side carefully. The seat was cold, untouched. Nothing left behind. The realization hit me fully. I had sat next to a man who was real, who had responded to calls, who had sat through traffic stops, who had shared the patrol with me for hours, and yet according to every record, he had never existed, had never been allowed on duty. The precinct had no knowledge of him, the dispatcher had no record, and the system showed nothing. I reported the incident the next morning. I explained every detail, every call, every moment, every interaction. There was an investigation, and the internal review was thorough. Cameras were checked, key fob logs were re-examined, roll calls reviewed. Nothing. There was no explanation. No record of him entering the building, no backup logs, nothing in the system. Weeks later, I returned to normal duty. The memory of that night stayed with me, a persistent weight I couldn't shake. I never saw Officer R again. Colleagues mentioned his suspension, but none of them remembered him being on duty that night. The night remained on the record as a standard solo patrol. But I knew. I had sat beside him. I had worked calls with him. I had seen him, talked to him in my own way, shared the night shift. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to be possible. But it happened. And I learned that sometimes the city holds details that don't show up in any report, any log, any record. There are nights where reality bends in ways that make no sense, where human error and the limits of the system collide with something you can see and touch, but that officially doesn't exist. I never forgot him. Not his face, not his hands, not the way he drove through Queens like it was the most normal night in the world. And I carry the memory every time I'm on patrol, always double-checking, always aware that even in the system we trust, there are gaps. Things can happen that no one explains, things you can't report fully because nothing supports it on paper. Officer R may never be found in any record, but I know he was there. He was real. He was sitting next to me. And that fact alone changed the way I look at the city, the system, and what we think is under control. The shift ended, the sun rose, and the streets returned to their normal rhythm. I filed my paperwork and left, still shaken, but with a strange, quiet certainty. Some things happen that don't need validation. They exist because you experience them, and that is enough. From that night on, I always check my partners, always double-check the roster, always remain aware that reality can have cracks you never expect. And some of them are right beside you, staring forward, hands at 10 and 2, never blinking. I remember that night as clearly as if it just happened. I was alone on patrol, my shift stretching long and silent through the outskirts of the city. I had driven past the last cluster of streetlights and was on a road that ran alongside abandoned warehouses and broken sidewalks. The kind of road that only gets used when people are looking for trouble or trying to disappear. The hum of the engine and the crackle of my radio were the only things breaking the quiet, and even that felt thin and distant, like someone had lowered the volume on the world. The streetlights were sparse, flickering occasionally, throwing long, uneven shadows across the asphalt. I kept my hand close to my service weapon, not because I expected trouble, but because the silence itself was heavy, pressing against my chest. Every time a car passed, I would tense up, checking mirrors reflexively, making sure nothing followed me. There was a low fog settling in, hugging the ground, making the edges of the road vanish. My headlights cut through it in pale cones, illuminating patches of crumbling concrete and the occasional discarded bottle or rag. I had been driving slowly, scanning the buildings, watching for movement, when I noticed something out of place. One of the warehouses had a back door slightly ajar. That was unusual. All the doors should have been locked and sealed at this hour. My first instinct was to keep moving, but my patrol instincts kicked in. I circled the building slowly, eyes narrowing, trying to see if anyone was inside. The darkness was thick, swallowing the corners of the warehouse, but I could see faint shapes moving inside, just beyond the glass of the broken windows. I parked a little down the street, leaving the car running. The engine was a small comfort, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone, though I knew that wasn't true. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio, walking cautiously toward the building. The ground was littered with trash, broken glass crunching under my boots. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust and decay mixed with something I couldn't name. Each step felt louder than the last, echoing against the walls of the empty street. The door creaked when I pushed it further open. Inside, it was worse than I expected. Broken pallets were stacked haphazardly against the walls. Old machinery sat unused and coated in dust, and the air was so still it felt like I was breathing through water. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing footprints in the dust. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old. I followed them slowly, each step measured, listening for the slightest sound, anything that would tell me I wasn't alone. I reached the far end of the warehouse, and that's when I saw it. A small group of people huddled together, moving quickly, almost in panic. They froze when they saw me, faces turning pale in the flashlight's glare. There was no time for questions. The leader of the group made a split-second decision and bolted toward a side door. I ran after him, calling for backup over the radio, but the signal crackled and barely came through. My shoes slipped on the wet concrete as I chased him into the alley behind the warehouse. The alley was narrow, filled with dumpsters and rusted barrels, the kind of place that smelled like decay and rot. I cornered him at the end of the alley. He was shaking, eyes wide, trying to find a way out. I kept my stance steady, hands raised, weapon holstered but ready. He wasn't violent, just desperate, and I could feel the fear radiating off him. I managed to get him against the wall without incident, radioing in his description and position. Within minutes, or maybe it felt like hours, other units arrived. The relief was immediate and tangible. Having backup there, seeing the uniforms, the flashlights cutting through the fog, made the situation feel manageable again. We secured the area and rounded up the rest of the group. They were young, mostly late teens or early 20s, clearly scared out of their minds. One by one, I escorted them to the patrol cars, keeping my flashlight trained on them, my heart still hammering. The whole scene smelled of sweat and fear, of concrete dust and something sour in the air. It took a while to check everyone and ensure none of them were armed or carrying anything dangerous. When that was done, I stayed behind with the first guy I caught, making sure the area was clear before leaving. As the other officers loaded the suspects into vehicles, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The city noise seemed distant now, like it belonged to another world. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the pale glow of streetlights further down the road. My hands were shaking, not from fear alone, but from the tension of being alone in a dangerous place for so long, trusting only my instincts. By the time I got back to my car, the adrenaline had begun to fade. I took a moment to sit in the driver's seat, looking around at the warehouse and alley one last time. The night was quiet again, almost eerily so, but it felt different now. It felt like the city had settled, acknowledging that the danger had passed, and that I had handled it. I radioed in my status, informing dispatch that the scene was secure and that backup was in control. The crackle of the radio was no longer lonely. It was reassurance, proof that I wasn't completely on my own. Driving back to the station, the streets seemed less threatening, more familiar. I thought about the group I had apprehended, about the fear in their eyes, and about the silent warehouse that could have ended very differently if I hadn't been there. There was satisfaction in knowing I had acted correctly, that my training had kept me calm and observant under pressure. I parked the car, stepped out, and felt the cool night air on my face. Alone on patrol had been tense and exhausting, but it was also a reminder of why I had chosen this work. To protect, to respond, to be ready when no one else was there. I filed my report carefully, detailing everything I had seen and done. Every footprint, every movement, every sound mattered, because it painted the full picture of the night. By the time I finished, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting light over the streets I had just patrolled. The city looked peaceful, even welcoming, and I realized that the night's work, though frightening and isolating at times, had ended successfully. I walked out of the station, tired but steady, feeling the weight of the night lift from my shoulders. Alone had meant responsibility, focus, and careful observation, but it had also meant proving to myself that I could handle the unknown. The city was waking up, and I knew that today, people would go about their lives unaware of what had happened just hours before, and that was exactly how it should be. My shift had ended, but the satisfaction of keeping others safe stayed with me, a quiet, steady pride that made all the fear and tension of the night worth it. I remember the night like it was yesterday, though I try not to think about it too much. I had been working a late shift, around 2 in the morning, in a part of the city I didn't usually patrol. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional car gliding by with its headlights slicing through the darkness. My car's engine hummed quietly as I drove slowly through the familiar grid of streets, the radio crackling with the distant chatter of other units. I liked these late hours sometimes. The city felt different at night. Quiet, controlled. But that night, something felt off, though I didn't know what it was at first. I had just cleared a minor disturbance, a drunk arguing in front of a corner store, and had resumed patrol. My partner had called in sick, so I was alone. That's when dispatch pinged me with a report of a suspicious vehicle parked in a dead-end alley near an industrial warehouse district. The alley wasn't usually a place anyone went to unless they had a reason. It was narrow, the buildings on either side tall and old, casting long shadows under the dim streetlights. I drove slowly toward the location, sirens off, trying to appear casual in case someone was watching. When I arrived, I saw an old sedan, rusty and out of place, sitting halfway down the alley. Its windows were fogged up from the cold night air, and the engine was still warm, though there was no one inside when I looked in. I parked my cruiser a few feet back, leaving room in case it tried to leave, and shut off the engine. I stepped out, the soles of my boots crunching against the gravel and scattered glass on the ground. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp metal. I kept my flashlight in my hand, scanning the area. The alley was silent, except for the distant hum of a highway a few blocks away. I approached the car cautiously, taking note of small details. The hood slightly dented, the tires uneven, a sticker on the rear windshield that had faded letters. Something about the car didn't sit right with me. I circled it slowly, shining my flashlight on the tires, the undercarriage, and the door handles. That's when I noticed something inside, a small bag on the passenger seat, tightly zipped, with what looked like a bundle wrapped in brown paper. I didn't touch it at first. Something in my gut told me to be careful. I called dispatch and requested a unit to check the vehicle, just to have backup, though I knew it might take a while to get someone out there. While I waited, I decided to check the perimeter. I moved quietly along the alley, my flashlight cutting through the dark spaces between dumpsters and stacked wooden pallets. There was a faint sound of dripping water somewhere toward the back of the warehouse, echoing against the brick walls. My heart rate quickened slightly. I've been on calls with worse, but the quiet tension of a single officer alone can do strange things to your senses. Every small sound felt amplified. I could hear my own breathing, slow and steady, but loud in my ears. I kept reminding myself to stay calm. After a few minutes, I went back to the car. I leaned over to peer inside again. The bag had shifted slightly, now leaning against the passenger door, as if someone had just moved it. I froze, shining my light directly on it, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. I reached for my radio to give dispatch an update when I noticed a scrap of paper sticking out of the bag. I grabbed it carefully with gloved hands, opening it slowly. Written in neat, tight handwriting were a few numbers and letters, a name, and an address. I didn't recognize it, but I felt a sudden chill. It looked organized, deliberate. I decided then that I needed to search the car thoroughly. I moved to the driver's side and carefully tried the door handle. Locked. The passenger side also locked. I checked the trunk, no luck. No keys in sight. My mind raced through scenarios. Was this car stolen? Was someone hiding inside? The longer I stared, the more tense I felt. I could almost hear the faintest scraping noise from inside the car, but I couldn't be sure. The shadows in the alley were playing tricks on my eyes, stretching and shifting as my flashlight passed over them. I stepped back and decided to call for a tow truck and AK-9 unit. I didn't want to take any chances. While waiting, I stayed in my car, doors locked, scanning the alley through the windshield. Time seemed to stretch. 15 minutes felt like an hour. Every now and then, a car would pass on the nearby street, headlights reflecting off the sedan, making it look briefly empty and then suddenly ominous again. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white, but my training kicked in. Stay alert. Observe. Don't panic. Eventually, the tow truck arrived, followed shortly by the K-9 unit. I got out and kept my distance while the officer handled the dog. The dog moved cautiously toward the car, sniffing the tires and doors. After a tense minute, the dog barked once and retreated, tail high, but clearly agitated. The K-9 officer gestured for me to stand back. He used a tool to unlock the driver's side door. The car was empty. No one inside. The bag was examined next. It contained stacks of cash, carefully bundled, and several IDs with different names. My stomach sank. This wasn't just a stolen car. It was part of something bigger. Possibly a ring, maybe even a local crime operation. It made sense why someone would leave it here, in this dead-end alley, at this time of night. I felt a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief that no one was hiding in the car, but tension knowing how close I had been to walking into a dangerous situation alone. We called in additional units, and the car and its contents were secured. I filled out my report meticulously, noting every detail: the car's condition, the alley layout, the contents of the bag, the time, every sound I remembered. It was hours before the scene was cleared, and by then, the first light of dawn was brushing against the warehouse rooftops. I sat in my cruiser, exhausted but alive, feeling the adrenaline finally ebb. The city was waking up slowly, people starting their day unaware of what had been sitting in that alley hours before. Looking back, I realized how important training, patience, and attention to detail were. One small mistake, one overlooked sound or shadow, could have led to a confrontation that I wasn't ready for alone. But by staying calm, observing carefully, and calling for backup, the situation was handled safely. It reinforced the quiet truth of the job. The night is full of unknowns, and sometimes the scariest moments are the ones where nothing seems to happen, yet everything could go wrong. By the time my shift ended, I had processed the entire night in my head multiple times. Every sound, every shadow, every instinct I had relied on. I drove home slowly, lights on, still aware of the city's quiet pulse. I parked outside my apartment and sat for a long time in the driver's seat before getting out. There was a lingering tension in my shoulders, a reminder that I had walked close to danger, yet survived it through caution and composure. That night, I went inside, showered, and finally slept, knowing I had done everything I could to stay safe and to handle the unknown carefully. The city was still there, dark corners and all, but I felt ready to face it again. It was past midnight when the line rang at the front desk, a direct line to the station instead of the usual 911 feed. The office was quiet, empty except for the night dispatcher, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the faint tapping of keyboards from other officers in the back. I answered, expecting the standard reports or a routine check-in. That expectation vanished in the first few words. No greeting, no explanation, nothing casual. Just a voice, low and calm, that began reciting instructions in a way that immediately set my teeth on edge. Mark the alley behind 27 Capel Street. The second dumpster. Don't touch it. I paused, my grip tightening around the receiver. The voice continued, and I realized it wasn't just giving an address. It went on to state my full name, my night patrol roster, my partner's blood type from an incident report filed months ago, and the exact number of rounds in my duty magazine at that moment. The list was precise. The voice knew details it had no right to know. My heart started to race. In nearly 10 years on the force, I had never encountered a call like this. No chatter, no background noise, no attempt at identification. It was all clinical and focused, as if whoever it was had been observing everything about me for weeks, maybe months. I hung up slowly, feeling a cold sweat along the back of my neck. My partner, sitting at a corner desk doing paperwork, noticed my tension immediately. I described the call. He raised an eyebrow, more curious than alarmed at first. "We're not talking someone who's just messing around," he said after a pause. "They have access to internal records. That's not easy to get." I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in the station suddenly seemed heavier. Every movement in the hallway made my stomach knot. I knew the address. 27 Capel Street was a narrow, back-alley building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Old warehouses, a few small businesses that had shut down, and the dumpsters behind every building that no one ever looked at. It was the kind of alley where a call like this could turn deadly if handled incorrectly. We waited a few minutes before grabbing gloves and heading out, trying to stay calm, maintaining a professional detachment, but every step felt heavier than the last. The streets were empty, the glow from the streetlights flickering off wet asphalt from a rain earlier in the evening. The alley behind 27, Capel Street, stretched between two buildings, the walls darkened with grime, the air damp and carrying the faint smell of rot mixed with exhaust. There were 3 dumpsters in a row. The second one, the one the caller mentioned, sat against a wall where the shadows pooled. My partner knelt down, gloves on, peering into the small space around the lid. I stayed back, keeping my flashlight trained on the alley and the entrances, scanning for movement. Everything felt wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The night was too still. No rats scurrying, no wind rustling trash bags, no distant car engines. Just silence and the occasional drip of water from the roof above. He opened the lid slowly, and the smell hit us before we could even see inside. It was unmistakable, the kind of putrid metallic odor that made your stomach flip and eyes water. The contents were carefully arranged, wrapped in a way that suggested thought and planning. It was horrifying in a precise, clinical way, the kind of thing that belonged in a report, but not anywhere near living, breathing people. My partner stepped back immediately, shutting the lid and sliding the dumpster back into its position against the wall. I didn't want to look too closely, but the sense of relief that we weren't the first ones to handle it was overshadowed by the unease that had settled in my chest. The caller's instructions were clear: don't touch it. And they weren't just precautionary words. Whoever this was, they had insider knowledge and the ability to observe from afar. We moved back slowly, not saying a word, our eyes scanning every corner of the alley, every shadow near the building's edges. The quiet was oppressive, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. We radioed dispatch, giving them a detailed report, but there was no mention of who could have called, no leads, no explanation. Back at the station, the unease didn't lift. The phone line had been secure, and the caller had used a direct line that should have been logged in internal systems. We checked. No traces of the call beyond the timestamp and the recorded conversation. Security cameras didn't show anyone lingering near the front desk. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously, knew our routines, and had access to sensitive information that no outsider should ever see. The implication was terrifying. It wasn't just about what was in the dumpster. It was about who could be watching, who could know. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that every detail of my patrol, every shift, every movement was being monitored. I double-checked locks, ran through equipment counts, reviewed access logs repeatedly. The station administration was concerned, but there was nothing to trace. The call had been a ghost in the system, a reminder that sometimes the danger wasn't visible, that it could come from someone using knowledge as a weapon. Eventually, the alley behind 27, Capel Street, became a restricted zone for us during night patrols. We kept a discreet distance and rerouted our usual checks. I never learned who made that call or how they got the information. The details remained the same: my name, my partner's blood type, my duty rounds. That much was never wrong, and that certainty was the part that kept me uneasy. Months later, the department flagged unusual access to personnel files and internal records. An investigation traced it to a small-time hacker who had managed to gain limited access months prior. He hadn't known the significance of the information until he stumbled across my patrol schedule. It was terrifying in a calculated way. What he didn't know was that the actual contents of the dumpster had been part of a criminal disposal that was extremely dangerous, explosives and chemical agents improperly stored. If anyone had touched it without the caution we exercised, the result could have been catastrophic. Knowing that we were spared by someone else's precision and warning didn't make it easier to sleep at night. It left a permanent mark. I learned that danger wasn't always about confrontation, gunfire, or high-speed chases. Sometimes it was about knowledge, timing, and the quiet awareness that someone could see and know more than they should. I still patrol the alleys around Capel Street when I get assigned the night shift. The dumpsters sit in the same position, unchanged. Nothing about them has been touched, and nothing ever will be without caution. I make sure every officer on the night roster knows about it, not because it's a story to scare, but because it's a lesson in vigilance. In our line of work, what you don't see can be just as dangerous as what you do. And sometimes the quietest warning is the one you survive because you listened. The call never came again, and neither did the intrusions into our files. But I never forgot the voice, the calm, precise tone, the way it knew me better than anyone should. It's a reminder that some dangers are silent, but that doesn't make them any less real. We were lucky that night, and I've spent every shift since remembering just how fragile that luck can be. I was alone in Substation 14, going over seized items in the storage room. The building was old, and so was this room. The walls had that faint smell of rust and dust, the kind that sticks in your nose after a few minutes. The metal lockers, the cages we kept bigger items in, were ancient, thick metal bars with grates that would rattle like chains if you slammed them too hard. It had always made the room feel tense, even on normal days, but tonight I was alone. The rest of the team had gone home, leaving me to finish the inventory log, check receipts, and organize the items we had confiscated over the past week. I had been in that room dozens of times, so I knew every sound it made, every squeak and creak. The faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights was steady, almost comforting. The air was cold and dry. I was sorting through a stack of seized phones when I noticed it. The kilo of high-grade drugs we had processed earlier that day. It was sitting on a shelf 3 cages down from the door, wrapped in its standard evidence bag. Everything about it seemed normal, until I saw it shift. At first, I thought I imagined it. My eyes had been straining under the harsh lights for hours. But then it moved again, slowly at first, then faster. The whole package slid forward 3 or 4 inches, and hit the metal grate with a loud clang. The cage shook. The sound was harsh, echoing against the walls. It startled me so badly I knocked over a small box of paperwork, scattering files across the floor. My heart jumped. I froze for a moment, trying to figure out what had happened. The motion sensor lights flicked on immediately. That's when I realized how strange it was. The sensors were positioned above each cage to detect movement in front of them. I knew they were very sensitive. Even a mouse would set them off. But there had been no motion. The impact of the sliding package had triggered the lights, not someone walking past them. I stepped closer, my shoes squeaking on the concrete floor, and looked at the cage. The package was at the front, the way it had been thrown by some invisible force. But the cage was closed. The lock was intact. There was no sign anyone had been inside. I went over to the security monitor. Substation 14 had cameras in every corner of the storage area, and the footage was supposed to be crystal clear. I replayed the last 5 minutes, rewinding and slowing it down. Nothing. The door had never opened. The back wall, the sides, nothing. No blind spots. Nobody had reached inside. The package had moved from the middle of the shelf, 3 feet away from any possible contact. It defied logic. I replayed it again and again, even checked the angles from other cameras in case I had missed something. There was nothing. My stomach sank. I started to walk around the cage slowly, checking for anything that could explain it. Maybe the shelf was uneven. Maybe someone had tampered with it earlier. But no, the shelves were solid, bolted to the wall. There were no visible defects, no vibration from the building, nothing at all. I tapped the shelf with my hand. It didn't budge. I even tried to push the package back to the center. It stayed put, heavy and firm. There was no way it could have slid on its own under any normal circumstances. I felt my pulse quicken. I was trained to handle tense situations, but this was different. It wasn't an arrest gone wrong. It wasn't a suspect arguing or resisting. There was no danger I could identify, yet my instincts were screaming that something was off. The silence in the storage room was now overwhelming. Every small noise, my own breathing, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant hum of a police radio in the station beyond the walls, was amplified. The walls felt closer than usual, the metal cages taller, the room smaller. I forced myself to breathe steadily. I went back to the shelves and started checking the other packages, one by one, to see if anything else had moved. All the smaller items were perfectly aligned. Everything else was normal. Only that single kilo had shifted. I checked the floor underneath. No oil, no water, nothing that would reduce friction. The cage floor was dry, rough concrete, the shelf solid steel. Nothing to make the package slide forward. I decided to take a closer look at the packaging. Maybe something had expanded inside. Maybe moisture or temperature change had caused it to warp. I examined it under the fluorescent lights, turning it slowly in my hands. Everything seemed perfectly normal. No tears, no swelling, nothing. It was heavy, dense, exactly the way we had logged it hours ago. I placed it back carefully and stepped away, trying to calm my nerves. The rest of the night passed slowly. I double-checked the cameras, the locks, even the motion sensors themselves. Everything functioned normally. I even tested the lights by walking in front of them. They reacted immediately. Everything was working, except the one incident that had no explanation. Every time I thought I had a logical answer, it slipped through my mind like water. There was nothing. I finished the rest of the inventory more quickly than usual. my focus constantly broken by the memory of the sliding package. I logged everything in the system, triple-checking numbers and quantities. Even the simplest tasks, stacking boxes, wiping dust, counting evidence bags, felt tense, like I was waiting for something to happen again. But it didn't. The room remained quiet, oppressive, and still. By the time I was done, it was past midnight. I double-checked the locks on all the cages, the security doors, and the perimeter cameras. Everything was secure. I walked out of the storage room and locked it behind me. The metal grate rattled slightly in the latch, making me jump, but I forced myself to breathe and pushed the feeling aside. As I walked down the empty hallway back to the main station, I replayed everything in my mind. The movement, the impact, the way the package slid like it had been pushed from nowhere. I couldn't explain it. Not with physics, not with logic, not with anything I had experienced in my career. And yet, I knew it had happened. My fear wasn't from the unknown in a supernatural sense. It came from the realization that something could occur without cause, something I could not account for, not even in a controlled environment like a storage cage in a police station. By the time I reached the front desk, my shift was over. I signed out, grabbed my coat, and stepped into the cold night. The station was quiet, the parking lot empty except for a few patrol cars. The wind was sharp, carrying the faint smell of asphalt and diesel. I took a deep breath, trying to let go of the unease that had followed me from the storage room. I went home that night still thinking about it. I couldn't stop replaying the footage, the sliding package, the sound of the cage shaking. I couldn't rationalize it. I finally had to accept that sometimes, in my line of work, you encounter things that defy explanation. You can check everything, verify every detail, and still face events that make no sense. Weeks later, the storage room returned to normal. Nothing else moved on its own. But I never forgot that night. Every time I walked past that cage, I remember the way it shifted, the way it shook. I don't fear ghosts or anything supernatural. What I fear is the reality that sometimes, even in a room full of rules, order, and control, the world will still surprise you. The fear comes from knowing there are things that happen that no training, no equipment, and no experience can ever fully explain. And sometimes, that's more than enough to make a seasoned officer uneasy. I got called out to a noise complaint at an old RCMP training range about 6 miles outside of Leduc, just as the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. It was the kind of place most people didn't even know existed. Overgrown, surrounded by forest, and completely abandoned for years. The road in was gravel and full of potholes, the kind that shook the car so bad you thought the suspension might come apart. When we first got the call, my partner and I assumed it would be some kids out there messing around, shooting off fireworks, or maybe playing with some old targets left behind. I've been on enough night shifts to know how often abandoned places attract trouble. But this was different. From the moment we drove in, the air had a kind of tension that made it hard to breathe, like the woods themselves were holding something in. The lot was large, flat, surrounded by dense spruce and aspen, with some old concrete bunkers scattered around, and a tall back wall that had probably once been used for firearms practice. The gravel crunched under our boots as we approached the range, and the only sounds were the wind rattling through the trees and the occasional distant call of a crow. That changed when we reached the wall. The first thing that hit me was the smell, faint but unmistakable, a mix of wet earth, something metallic, and decay. And then I saw it. The wall itself was covered in slugs, hundreds of them, crawling in slow, deliberate patterns. At first, I thought maybe it was just a natural infestation, but as I moved closer, my stomach twisted. Among the slime, someone had drawn tally marks directly into the concrete, carved deep enough that the wall seemed almost scarred. They weren't random. The marks were organized into neat vertical columns, spaced evenly apart, and each column had a label written in crude, heavy letters. Bears 4, Wolves 9, Men 3, Boys 1. No names, no dates, just these numbers and nothing else. They were clean, not smudged or faded. Whoever made them had been meticulous. I crouched down to inspect the wall, counting the slugs again and the marks. The bullets embedded in the concrete were bright, fresh copper, not tarnished. Whoever had shot the board had done it within a couple of hours at most. There was a rhythm to it, a precision. It wasn't a random spree or someone just messing around. This was methodical, almost ritualistic, in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I checked around the perimeter. The grass and undergrowth were trampled in certain areas, but there weren't obvious footprints leading in or out beyond the initial path we'd taken. It was clear someone was careful about their movements, someone who knew these woods well. That thought sank in heavier than anything else. We weren't just dealing with kids. This person had been here recently, watching, waiting, keeping track. The wall wasn't just a target, it was a scoreboard. Someone was keeping score of what they had killed. And the list, it wasn't just animals. I stepped back from the wall, scanning the area. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing empty shells littering the dirt. I counted at least 3 different calibers. Some were small, some large, all fired recently. Every detail screamed that this was no ordinary hunter. Whoever had been here had been tracking more than wildlife. The thought of it being a human target, a real person, was almost too much to let settle in. I forced myself to focus on the evidence in front of me. The woods themselves were dense, and as I shined my flashlight between the trees, I noticed broken branches, snapped twigs, footprints that weren't uniform, some partial, some full. Whoever had been here was moving with purpose, leaving just enough trace for someone else, or perhaps themselves, to follow later. I took pictures, cataloged the shells, checked for fingerprints, and logged everything into our report. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The silence was thick, oppressive. Every time a branch cracked under my boots or a slug squirmed over the wall, I flinched. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me, and I felt eyes on us, even if I couldn't see anyone. My partner and I did a slow sweep around the area, checking the tree line, the old bunkers, every hollow and shadow. Nothing. But the methodical nature of the tally marks and the fresh bullets told me that this person could still be out there, hiding, observing, keeping score. Whoever it was, they weren't afraid of leaving evidence. They were deliberate, meticulous, careful. By the time we left the site, I had a list of actions to follow up. The RCMP range was locked down temporarily. I notified the Criminal Investigation Unit, and we made sure the scene was untouched for proper processing. But on the drive back, the image of the scoreboard didn't leave me. Bears, wolves, men, boys. The labels weren't just targets, they were categories. And someone had been hunting all of them, marking each kill like a professional tally. Over the next few days, we ran background checks on hunters, survivalists, people with access to the area, anyone who could have been out there. Nothing concrete came up. The woods were large, the area remote, and whoever had been tracking, shooting, and counting had left almost no evidence beyond that wall. The leaderboard remained the only clue, a grim record carved into concrete, gleaming in fresh copper and slime. We increased patrols around the area, checking for any signs of movement, fresh tracks, or unauthorized access. Every time we returned, I felt the same knot in my stomach, the same tension as when I first saw the wall. It was as if the place remembered what had happened and was waiting for someone to continue the score. Weeks later, we received reports of poaching and illegal activity in surrounding forests, but nothing directly linked to that particular wall. Whoever it was had vanished, leaving just the marks, the slugs, the fresh bullets, and the knowledge that they had been there counting, tracking, scoring. Eventually, the case went cold for lack of leads. But every time I drive past that stretch of road, I find myself looking into the forest, imagining someone out there, careful, watching, taking notes, keeping track of the world in the way they see fit. The wall remains as a stark reminder that someone had crossed the line from hunting to counting human life as just another statistic. It's one of the few calls I've had where the evidence didn't just tell a story. It demanded that you feel the presence of the person behind it. The last time I drove out there, I took the longer route through the woods just to see the wall. It's still covered in slugs, still bearing those 4 columns of tally marks. The numbers haven't changed since that night, but the knowledge that someone has been keeping track somewhere else, maybe even closer than we think, lingers in my mind. It's the kind of thing you can't forget. You can't pretend it's over. That scoreboard doesn't just record kills. It records intent, precision, and the terrifying certainty that someone is still out there, watching and counting. And that's something you carry with you long after you leave the woods. I remember the morning like it was a weight pressing against my chest. The sun had just begun to rise, weak and orange, barely cutting through the smog that hung over the city. I was part of a team assigned to a corruption sweep at a precinct that had earned a reputation for running its own side operations, bribes, tampered reports, and off-the-books deals. We were supposed to move quickly, hit hard, and catch anyone who might be trying to shred evidence before the city's internal affairs arrived. The plan was simple in theory, but I had a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake. We rolled in before the streets were alive with traffic, before the smell of fried street food and exhaust filled the air. Our convoy stopped a block from the station, and we made our way in on foot. The station itself looked normal at first glance, standard gray cement, the faint sheen of old paint on the walls. But walking down the corridor toward the chief's office, I could feel the difference in the air, something thick, almost oily, like tension that hadn't been released in years. The lockers, the evidence cabinets, the small bulletin boards with crime stats and wanted posters, they all looked mundane. Too mundane. The chief's office was at the far end of the hallway, the door shut tight. We didn't knock. That was the whole point. Inside, the room smelled of dust, cigarette smoke, and something sweet that made me uneasy. Behind the office, tucked into a small, unassuming storage closet, we found what we were looking for. At first, it looked like a standard supply closet, the kind you forget about. Boxes of paper, old uniforms, cleaning supplies. Then we noticed the pegboard on the far wall. Pegboards usually hold tools or keys, but this one was different. Every peg had a manila envelope hanging from it. Each envelope had a name written neatly, a cash amount, and a stamp. Paid. Covered. Silenced. Pending. The neatness of it was what made it chilling. This wasn't chaos. This was methodical, planned, and long-running. I stepped closer, my stomach tightening. We moved along the board, scanning names. Some I recognized, officers who had been caught with a suspicious lifestyle, sudden car upgrades, unexplained vacations. Others were lower-ranking, rookies barely a year on the force. My fingers twitched involuntarily as I passed each envelope. Then I saw it. My name. I froze. The envelope was exactly like the others, crisp, manila, stamped with pending. The amount, 75,000 pesos. My mind raced. I had never taken a bribe. I had never even been offered one formally. My conscience had always been my shield, my guide, the reason I stayed in this force despite the rot around me. And yet here it was, an envelope with my name, a sum of money, and a stamp that made it clear the system expected me to take it. I couldn't breathe properly. My heart thumped so loudly, I was afraid the others would hear it. I had to remind myself that this was real, not a hallucination born from stress or fatigue. Every other envelope screamed the same message. People were being watched, catalogued, and judged. It was organized crime inside the very system meant to uphold the law. And somehow, someone had decided I should be part of it. I pulled the envelope off the peg. The paper felt heavier than it should, like the weight of the accusation itself pressed down on my hands. I could almost feel eyes on me, though the closet was empty. I didn't need supernatural fear to know I was exposed. Someone had made a file on me. Someone had thought about me in the cold calculations that had governed this operation. The envelope wasn't just a bribe, it was a statement. It was an instruction, a warning, and a judgment all at once. We documented everything meticulously. Photos, notes, serial numbers, timestamps. I moved mechanically, my hands trembling as I bagged the evidence, each click of the camera echoing too loudly in my head. My mind replayed every interaction I had ever had in that precinct. Every time I had refused an officer's suggestion, every report I had filed that might have annoyed someone higher up. Was that enough to get me on this board? Did they think I would accept if pushed, or were they preparing a file in anticipation of some future weakness? The day wore on. We processed the rest of the envelopes. The more we uncovered, the more impossible it felt that anyone could be trusted. Names I had respected, people I had counted on, were all just cogs in the same corrupt machine. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. But the envelope with my name kept gnawing at me. It was a threat that didn't speak, a silent accusation. After the operation, back at the command center, we started the internal review. I turned my thoughts inward. I thought about my career, the choices I had made, and the people I had trusted. I realized that for the first time, I had to protect myself, not just professionally, but personally. My name on that pegboard meant someone knew enough about me to manipulate me, or at least try. That realization settled like a stone in my chest. I made my decisions quickly. First, I ensured that my finances, my interactions, and my communications were all transparent. Every transaction, every call, every meeting was logged. I wanted nothing that could be twisted into a lie or used against me. Second, I began documenting everything. Not just the sweep, but my entire professional conduct. Reports, evidence logs, incident notes. Everything was duplicated and backed up in multiple secure locations. Third, I began observing. Subtle shifts in the precinct's behavior, unexplained favors, minor deviations from routine. Everything I had ignored before now became data points, signals I couldn't afford to miss. Weeks passed. The internal affairs investigation concluded, arrests were made, and some officers were suspended or terminated. The envelope with my name remained a stark reminder, though no one outside our sweep ever knew about it. It didn't matter if my name stayed clean. The knowledge that someone had targeted me changed my perspective permanently. I wasn't paranoid, I was prepared. I walked the precinct floors differently after that. I kept my head down, but my eyes were open. Every interaction was a test, every assignment a potential risk. I developed a network of allies quietly, people I could trust implicitly, and I checked everything twice. The envelope taught me one thing clearly: integrity alone isn't enough to survive. Awareness, preparation, and vigilance were equally critical. Months later, I revisited the closet. It was empty now. The pegboard had been removed, replaced with standard shelving. No evidence of the envelopes remained. But I knew the truth. The system could rot quietly, and someone could decide to mark you without your knowledge. I walked away that day with a strange mix of relief and caution. I hadn't taken the bribe. I hadn't broken. I hadn't been corrupted. But the knowledge of how close it had come stayed with me, a silent, persistent shadow in my mind. And in the end, that was enough. I knew the threat wasn't gone. It was just dormant, waiting for the right moment, the right weakness. But I would not be unprepared again. The envelope had tried to define me, but I had claimed control back. I had faced the evidence of corruption in my own precinct and walked out without losing myself. That, more than anything, felt like a victory. I never opened the envelope. I never took the money. I filed it, photographed it, and let it sit in a secure evidence locker until the investigation concluded. And each time I think about it, my heart still beats faster, but my mind is clear. I know the line between honesty and danger, and I stay on the side of truth. That one envelope, with my name stamped pending, changed me forever, but it didn't break me. I survived, intact, aware, and resolute. I would never let anyone put my name on a list like that again.